Welcome to
Heavy D Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading the Bible.
We don't read anymore, we only read.
Yeah, we read.
Yeah, we're reading with a capital T.
So go ahead and click the bell, subscribe. What? Oh, he knows what you're supposed to do. I don't have any idea.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell to never miss another video. And we are going to be reading. We are going to be reading. We're going to be reading the Bible.
It's not Ben-Hur today.
Then we are going to be doing the synopsis. We finished Ben-Hur, so we're moving on to the mystery book. If you can
and it's blue.
If you can guess what the book is, I will be amazed.
I'll give you a clue. I already said it in the last video.
Yeah,
okay.
Did.
So, all right. With all of that said, they're going to go and draw some pictures or color or something. Excuse me. And I'm going to read the English Standard Version of the Bible, Hebrews chapter 12. This is take 3. Here we go. All right. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him has endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? Of spirits and live. I thought it was and lives, but my brain. For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. That no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. That's the end of Hebrews chapter 12. So after we finish Hebrews tomorrow, beginning on the following day, let me know in the comments what book you think that I should read next. It's going to be an Old Testament book, and actually I think I've already had a conversation with one person that is watching, but if you have any input, this is your chance right now. With all of that said, I think it is time for the synopsis. We have a lovely assistant here to give the synopsis. There she is. And without further ado, here is Kimberly.
So we are actually reading Dragon Drums today from this book. And so I'm going to tell you about the other two books. So in the first book, we're introduced to this planet, and it's got this weird other planet that when like once every 200 I think years, what happens is the thread from the other planet goes over to the planet that they're on, and basically kills a lot of stuff. Hi, Granny Bear. And then, so the people on the planet, they decide to live in caves and places like that. And then they had these dragons. I think what they did was they took fire lizards and genetically altered them so that they were bigger and, then they resembled dragons. So they're like, let's call this dragon. And then, so they use the dragons to fight off the thread. And so we're introduced to Meneley. I keep calling her Melanie. So we're introduced to Meneley. I tried to say it, sorry. Meneley. Did I see it?
Yes.
Okay. So we're introduced to Meneley, and she really, really likes to sing and tune, which is, she likes to play instruments and sing. But her dad doesn't like her singing. So when the old harper dies, she's not allowed to sing at all. And, well, she is allowed to sing for the kids, because they need a teacher, and it's the harper's job to teach. But there was no replacement harper, because at Half Circle Seahold, it is a sea hold, and they fish, and after you start fishing, you can't really be a harper anymore. Okay, so what happens is, after the new harper got there, she's not allowed to sing, and so she runs away. She impresses 9 fire lizards, and then eventually, like maybe a few weeks later, maybe a month, she is caught in thread. So she tries to outrun it and get back to her cave, because she found a cave in the cliffside where she's living. And she can't get there. And then this dragon comes up and takes her over to this other hold. I forget what it's called. But she's then trained as a harper. Oh, thank you, Granny Bear. She's then trained as a harper, and the last book was her learning and adapting to her new life. And at the end of the last book, she became a real harper. Because earlier she was just an apprentice, so now she's a real harper. And that's about where we are, right?
Yes.
Here's Mom.
Hi. Okay, so Dragon Drums is more about somebody that she met in the last book named Pimer. And it starts on chapter 1. And if you remember, Pimer was he was very young, so he had a very sweet high soprano voice that, as we all know, as little boys become men, they lose that special talent. So he has been training in other areas as well, and we pick up from there. Chapter 1, Dragon Drums by Anne McCaffrey. The rumble, thud, boom of the big drums answering a message from the east roused Pimer. In his 5 turns at the Harpercraft Hall, he had never become accustomed to that bone-throbbing noise. Perhaps, he thought, sleepily turning over, if the drums beat every dawn, or in the same sequence, he'd get accustomed enough to sleep through it. But he doubted that. He was naturally a light sleeper, a talent picked up when he'd been a herder's boy, and had to keep an ear awake for night alarms among the runner beasts. The facility had often been to his advantage, since the other apprentices in his dormitory couldn't sneak up on him with vengeance in mind, and he was often awakened by discreet dragon-born visitors coming to see the Master Harper of Pern, or the arrivals and departures of Master Robinson himself, for he was surely one of the most important men on Pern, almost as influential as Falar and Lessa, the weir leaders of Bendon. Occasionally, too, on warm summer nights, when the shutters of the main hall were thrown back, the masters and journeymen assuming all the apprentices slept, he'd hear fascinating and uninhibited talk drifting on the night air. A small fellow like himself had to keep ahead of everyone else, and listening often showed him how. As he tried to get back to sleep for just a little longer in the gray dawn, the drum sequence echoed in his mind. The message had originated from Istahold's harper. He had caught the identifying signature. He couldn't be sure of the rest of the message, something about a ship. Maybe he ought to learn message drum beats. Not that they came in with such frequency now that more and more people owned little fire lizards to take messages around Pern. He wondered when he'd get his hands on a fire lizard egg. Meneley had promised him one when her queen Beauty mated. A nice thought on her part, Pimer reflected, realistically aware that Meneley might not be able to distribute Beauty's eggs as she wished. Master Robinson would want them placed to the Harper Hall's advantage, and Pimer couldn't find Master Robinson. One day, though, he'd have his fire lizard, a queen, or, at the least, a bronze. Pimer folded his hands behind his head, musing on such a delightful prospect. From having helped Meneley feed her 9, he knew a fair bit about them now. More than some people who had fire lizards, the same people who'd been claiming for turns that the fire lizards were boys' sun-dreams. That is, until Fënor, Brown Canth's rider, had impressed a little queen on a beach in the northern continent. Then Meneley, halfway across Pern, had saved a fire lizard queen's eggs from being drowned in the unusually high tides of that turn. Now everyone wanted a fire lizard, and admitted that they must be tiny cousins to the great dragons of Pern. Pimer shivered with delighted terror. Thread had fallen over Fort Hold yesterday. They'd been rehearsing Master Domic's new saga about the search for Lessa, and how she'd become weirwoman at Bendon just before the new pass of the Red Star. But Pimer had been much more aware of the silvery threads dropping through the skies above the tightly shuttered and sealed Harper Hall. He'd imagined, as he always did during Threadfall, the graceful passages of the great dragons as their fiery breath charred thread before it could fall to the ground to devour anything living, before it could burrow into any ground and multiply. Even thinking of that phenomena made Pimer quiver fearfully again. Before Master Robinson had discovered Meneley's talent at song-making, she'd actually lived outside her hold, caring for the 9 fire lizards she had impressed from the rescued clutch. If only, thought Pimer with a sigh, he wasn't immured in the craft hall. If only he had a chance to search seashores and find his own clutch. Of course, as a mere apprentice, he'd have to give the eggs to his craft master, but surely, if he found a whole clutch, Master Robinson would let him keep one. The sudden raucous call of a fire lizard startled him, and he sat up in alarm. The sun was now streaming across the outer side of the Harper Hall rectangle. He had fallen asleep again. If Rocky was screaming, he was late to help feed. With deft movements he dressed, except for his boots, and thudded down the steps, emerging into the courtyard just as he heard the second, more urgent summons from a hungry Rocky. When he saw that Camo was only just trudging up the steps outside the kitchen, clutching his bowl of scraps, Pimer drew a sigh of relief. He wasn't all that late. He thrust his feet into his boots, stuffed the laces inside to save time, and clumped across the court just as Meneley came down the steps from the main hall. Rocky, Mimic, and Lazy whirled above Pimer's head, chittering hungrily at him to move faster. Pimer glanced up, looking for Beauty. Meneley had told him that when the little queen was close to mating time, she'd seem to be more golden than ever. She was now circling to land on Meneley's shoulder, but she seemed the same color as ever. "Camo feed pretties?" The kitchen drudge smiled brightly as Meneley and Pimer reached him. "Camo feed pretties," Meneley and Pimer spoke the customary reassurance in chorus, grinning at each other as they reached for handfuls of meat scraps. Rocky and Mimic took their accustomed perches on Pimer's shoulders, while Lazy clung with far from indolent strength to his left forearm. Once the fire lizards settled to the business of eating, Pimer glanced at Meneley, wondering if she'd heard the drum message. She looked more awake than she usually did at this hour, and slightly detached from her immediate task. Of course, she might just be thinking up a new song, but writing tunes was not Meneley's only duty in the Harper Hall. As they fed the fire lizards, the rest of the hall began to stir. The drudges in the kitchen were roused to breakfast efforts by Sylvina and Abuna. In the junior and senior dormitories, occasional shouts punctuated random noises, and shutters of the journeymen's quarters were being opened to let in the fresh morning air. Once the fire lizards had wheeled up from their morning stretch of wings, Pimer, Meneley, and Camo separated. Camo, with a push from Meneley, was sent back to the kitchens. Then she and Pimer went up the main steps of the Harper Hall to the dining room. Pimer's first class that morning was chorus, for they were, as usual at this time of the turn, rehearsing the spring music for Lord Grove's feast. Master Domic had collaborated with Meneley this year and produced an uncommonly singable score for his ballad about Lessa and her golden queen dragon, Remoth. Pimer was to sing the part of Lessa. For once, he didn't object to having to sing a female role. In fact, that morning he waited eagerly for the chorus to finish the passage before his first entrance. The moment came, he opened his mouth, and to his amazement, no sound emerged. "Wake up, Pimer," said Master Domic, irritably rapping his stick on the music stand. He alerted the chorus. "We'll repeat the measure before the entrance. If you're now ready, Pimer." Usually, Pimer could ignore Master Domic's sarcasm, but since he had been ready to sing, he flushed uncertainly. He took a deep breath, hummed against his closed teeth as the chorus began again. He had tone, and his throat was sore, or wasn't sore, so he wasn't coming down with a stuffed head. The chorus gave him his entrance again, and he opened his mouth. The sound that emerged ranged from one octave to another, neither of which were in the score he held. A complete and odd silence fell. Master Domic frowned at Pimer, who was now swallowing against a fear that froze his feet to one spot and crept up his bones to his heart. "Pimer?" "Sir?" "Pimer, sing a scale in C." Pimer attempted to, and on the fourth note, though he had hardened his middle to iron for support, his voice again broke. Master Domic put down his stick and regarded Pimer. If there was any expression in the composition master's face, it was compassion, tinged with resigned irritation. "Pimer, I think you had best see Master Shonagar. Tilgan, you've been understudying the role?" "Me, sir? I haven't so much as glanced at it, not with Pimer." The startled apprentice's voice trailed off as Pimer, slowly, and with feet he could barely force to move, left the chorus hall and walked across the court towards Master Shonagar's room. He tried to close his ears to the sound of Tilgrin's tentative voice. Scorn gave him momentary relief from his cold fear. His had been a much better voice than Tilgrin's would ever be. Had been? Maybe he was just coming down with a cold. Pimer coughed experimentally, but knew even as he did so that no phlegm congested his lungs and throat. He trudged on to Master Shonagar, knowing the verdict and hoping against vain hope that somehow the flaw in his voice was transitory, that he'd managed to keep his soprano range long enough to sing Master Domic's music. Scuffing up the steps, he paused briefly in the threshold to accustom his eyes to the gloom within. Master Shonagar would only just have arisen and breakfasted. Pimer knew his master's habits intimately, but Shonagar was already in his customary position, one elbow on the wide table propping up his massive head, the other arm cocked against the columnar thigh. "Well, it's sooner than we might have expected, young Pimer," the master said in a quiet tone, which nonetheless seemed to fill the room. "But the change was bound to come sometime." A wealth of sympathy tinged the master's rich, mellow bass voice. The propping hand came away from the head and brushed aside the tones now issuing from the chorus hall. "Tilgrin will never come up to your measure." "Oh, sir, what do I do now my voice is gone? It's all I had." Master Shonagar's surprised contempt startled Pimer. "All you had? Perhaps, my dear Pimer, but by no means all you have. Not after 5 turns as my apprentice. You probably know more about vocal production than any journeyman in the craft." "But who would want to learn from me?" Pimer gestured to his slight adolescent frame, his voice cracking dramatically. "And how could I teach when I've no voice to demonstrate?" "Ah, but the distressing condition of your singing voice heralds other alterations that will remedy those minor considerations." Master Shonagar waved aside that argument, and then regarded Pimer through narrowed eyelids. "This occasion has not caught me." The thick fingers tapped against the bulging chest, unprepared. Now, a gusty sigh escaped Master Shonagar's full lips. "You have been without doubt or contradiction the most troublesome and ingenious, the laziest and the most audacious and mendacious of the hundreds of apprentices and voice students it has been my tiresome task to train to some standard. Despite yourself, you have achieved some measure of success. You ought to have achieved even more." Master Shonagar affected a pout. "I find it altogether too perverse, if completely in character, for you to decide on puberty before singing Domic's latest choral work. Undoubtedly, one of his best and written with your abilities in mind. Do not hang your head in my presence, young man." The master's bellowed, startled Pimer out of his self-pity reflections. "Young man! Yes, that's the crux. You are becoming a young man. Young men must have young manly tasks." "What?" In a single word, Pimer expressed his disbelief and distress. "That, my young man, is for the harper to tell you." Master Shonagar's thick forefinger pointed first at Pimer and then swung towards the front of the building, indicating Master Robinton's window. Pimer did not dare permit the hope that began to revive in him to blossom. Yet Master Shonagar wouldn't lie for any reason, certainly not to give him false hope. Then they both winced as Tilgrin erred in his slight reading. Instinctively glancing at his master, Pimer saw the pained expression on Master Shonagar's face. "Were I young Pimer, I'd stay out of Domic's sight as much as possible." Despite his depression, Pimer grinned wryly, aware that the brilliant composition master might well decide that Pimer had elected to thwart his musical ambition in this untimely voice change. Master Shonagar sighed heavily. "I do wish you'd have waited a trifle longer, Pimer." His groan was wistful as well as resigned. "Tilgrin is going to require much coaching to perform credibly. Now, don't you repeat that, young Pimer." The thick forefinger pointed unwaveringly at Pimer, who affected innocent shock at such an admonition might be needed. "Away with you." Obediently, Pimer turned, but he'd gone no more than a few paces to the door when a second shock stopped him. He whirled towards the voice master. "You mean just now, sir, don't you?" Just now, sir? Of course I mean now. Not this afternoon or tomorrow, but now. Now? And always? Asked Pimer uncertainly. If he could no longer sing, Master Shanagar would take on another special apprentice to perform those personal and private duties for him that Pimer had been undertaking in the past terms. Not only was Pimer reluctant to lose the privilege of being Master Shanagar's special lad, he honestly didn't wish to end this very rewarding association with the master. He liked Shanagar, and those services he had performed for his master had stemmed from that liking rather than a sense of duty. He had enjoyed above all the droll humor and florid speech of his master, of being teased for his bold behavior and called to task by a man he had never managed to deceive for an instant with any of his stratagems or ploys. Now, yes. And there was a rumble of regret in Shanagar's expressive voice that eased Pimer's sense of loss, but assuredly not always. And the master's tone was brisker, with only a hint of resigned irritation that he was not going to be forever rid of this small nuisance. How can we escape each other, immured as we are in the Harper Hall? Though Pimer knew perfectly well that Master Shanagar rarely left this hall, he was obscurely reassured. He made a half-turn and then came slowly back. This afternoon, you'll need some errands done. You may not be available, said Master Shanagar, his face expressionless, his voice almost as neutral. But, sir, who will come to you? And again Pimer's voice broke. You know you're not always busy after the midday meal. Or you know you're always busy after the midday meal. If you mean, said Shanagar, with real amusement crinkling his eye folds, do I plan to appoint Tilgan to the vacancy? Shh! I shall, of course, have to devote a great deal of time to improving his voice and musicality, but to have him lurking about on tap. The thick fingers wiggled with distaste. Away with you? The choice of your successor requires considerable thought. Not, mind you, that there are not hundreds of likely lads who would undoubtedly suit my small requirements to perfection. Pimer caught his breath in hurt, and then saw the twitch of Master Shanagar's expressive brows, and realized that this moment was no easier on the older man. Undoubtedly, Pimer tried to turn away on that light note, but found he could not, wishing that Master Shanagar might just this once. Go, my son. You will ever know where to find me, should the need arise. This time the dismissal was final, because the master slanted his head against his fist and closed his eyes, shamming weariness. This time, quickly, Pimer walked to the entrance, blinking at the bright sunlight after the darker hall. He paused on the bottom step, reluctant to take the final one that severed his association with Master Shanagar. There was a sudden hard lump in his throat that had nothing to do with his voice change. He swallowed, but the sensation of constriction remained. He rubbed his eyes with his knuckles that came away moist, and stood, fists clenched at his thighs, trying not to blubber. Master Robinson had something to tell him about new duties. So his voice change had been discussed by the masters. To be sure, he wouldn't have been callously thrown out of the Harper Hall and sent in some obscure disgrace back to his herdsman father and the dreary life of a beast farmer simply because he no longer had his soprano voice. No, that wouldn't be his fate, despite the fact that singing was his one undeniable harper skill. As Talmor said in his guitar and harp playing, he could accompany so long as his playing was drowned out by loud singing and other instruments. The drums and pipes he made under Master Durant's guidance were only passable and never got stamped for sale at gathers. He copied scores accurately enough when he put his mind to it, but he always found so many more interesting things to do than spending hours cramping his fingers to renew records someone else could do more neatly in half the time. Yet, when pushed to do it, Pimer didn't actually mind scribing, if he were allowed to add his own embellishments, which he wasn't, not with Master Arnor looking over his shoulder and muttering about wasted ink and hide. Pimer sighed deeply. The only thing he was really adept at was singing, and that was no longer possible. Forever? No, not forever. He spread his fingers in rejection of that prospect, and then closed them into tighter fists. He'd be able to sing all right. He'd learned too much from Master Shanagar about voice production and phrasing and interpretation, and he might not have a voice as an adult, but he wasn't going to sing unless he did. He had his reputation. Better if he never opened his mouth to sing another note. Tilgan flubbed another phrase. Pimer grinned, listening to Tilgan repeating the phrase correctly. They'd miss Pimer all right. He could sight-read any score, even one of Domic's, without missing a beat or an awkward interval, or those florid embellishments Domic insisted on writing for the treble parts. Yes, they'd miss Pimer in the chorus. That knowledge fortified him, and he took the final step onto the flagstones of the court. Clipping his thumbs over his belt, he began to saunter towards the main entrance of the Harper Hall. Not, he reminded himself, that a lowly apprentice who has just lost his privileged position should saunter when sent to the Master Harper of Pern. Pimer squinted into the sunlight at the fire lizards on the roof opposite. He didn't spot Master Robinton's bronze fire lizards there, among those sunning themselves with Meneley's 9. So the Master Harper wasn't with the day as yet. Come to think of it, Pimer reflected, he'd heard the clear baritone voice of the harper in the court late last night, and the noise of a dragon landing and departing. These days the harper spent more time away from the hall than in it. Pimer? Startled, he glanced up and saw Meneley standing at the top step of the main hall. She'd spoken quietly, and when he peered at her, he knew that she knew what had happened to him. It was rather audible, she said again, in that gentle tone which both irritated and appeased Pimer. Meneley, of all within the Harper Hall, would sympathize with him most acutely. She knew what it was to be without the ability to make music. Is that Tilgan singing? Yes, and it's all my fault, Pimer said. All your fault? Meneley stared at him in surprised amusement. Why did I have to pick now to break voice? Why, indeed. I'm sure you did it only to annoy Domic. Meneley grinned broadly at him, for they both had experiences with Domic's whimsical temper. Pimer had reached the top step and experienced another shock on this morning of surprises. He could almost look Meneley square in the eye, and she was tall for a girl. She reached out and ruffled his hair, laughing at his as he indignantly swatted her hand away. Come on, Master Robinson wants to see you. Why? What am I going to be doing now, do you know? Not for me to tell you, scamp, she said, striding on her long legs across the hall and forcing him to a jog pace to keep beside her. Meneley, that's not fair. Ha! She was pleased by his discomfiture. You've not long to wait. I will tell you this. Domic may not be pleased with your voice changed, but the master was. Ah, Meneley, one little hint, please. You know you owe me a favor or two. I do? Meneley savored her advantage. You do, and you know it. You could pay me back right now. Pimer was irritated. Why did she have to pick now to be difficult? Why waste a favor when a little patience on your part will bring the answer? They had reached the second level and were striding down the corridor toward the Harper's quarters. You'd better learn patience too, my friend. Pimer halted in disgust. Oh, come on, Pimer, she said with a broad swing of her arm. You're not a little any more to wheedle news out of me. And wasn't it you who warned me that you don't keep a master waiting? I've had enough surprises today, he said sourly, but he closed the distance between them just as she tapped politely on the door. The Master Harper of Pern, his silvering hair glinting in the sun, streaming in his windows, was seated at the work table. A tray before him, the steam of hot claw rising unnoticed as he offered pieces of meat to the fire lizard clinging to his left forearm. Glutton, greedy maw, don't claw me, that's bear skin, not patting. I'm feeding you as fast as I can, Zare, behave yourself. I'm perishing for a taste of my claw, but I'm feeding you first. Good morning, Pimer. You're adept at feeding fire lizards. Pop sustenance into Zare's mouth so I can get some of mine. The harper shot a look of desperate entreaty to Pimer. He whipped around the long work table and, grabbing up several chunks of meat, attracted Zare's gaze. Ah, that's more the thing, exclaimed Master Robinson after he'd had a long gulp of his claw. Absorbed in his task, Pimer wasn't at first aware of the harper's scrutiny, for the man was applying himself to his own food with his free right hand. Then Pimer saw the keen eyes on him, lids narrowed as if weighty from sleep. He could tell nothing from the harper's expression, for the long face was quiescent, slightly puffy around the eyes from sleep, the grooves and the corners of the mobile mouth pulled down with age and accumulated fatigue rather than displeasure. I shall miss your young voice, said the harper with gentle emphasis on young, but while we're waiting for you to settle into an adult placement, I've asked Shawnagar to release you to me. I've a suspicion that you won't mind too much, and a smile twitched the harper's lips, doing the odd job for me and Menely and my good Sibyl. Menely and Sibyl? Pimer gawked. I'm not sure I care for that emphasis, said Menely in a mock growl, subsiding as the harper threw her a quieting glance. I'd be your apprentice? Pimer asked the harper, holding his breath for the answer. Indeed, you'd have to be my apprentice at that, said Master Robinson, his voice and face turning droll. Oh, sir! Pimer was stunned at such good fortune. Zare squawked petulantly in the little silence, for Pimer had paused in his feeding. Sorry, Zare, said Pimer hastily, and resumed the task. However, and the harper cleared his throat while Pimer wondered what disadvantage to his enviable status was about to be disclosed. There had to be one, he knew. You will have to improve your skill in scribing. We must be able to read what you write, said Menely sternly. Learn to send and receive message drum accurately and rapidly. He looked at Menely. I know that Master Fandral is very keen to have his new message sender installed in every hauling craft, but it's going to take far too long to be useful to me. Then, too, there are some messages that should remain privy to the craft. He paused, staring long at Pimer. You were bred on a runner-beast hold, weren't you? Yes, sir, and I can ride any runner anywhere. Menely's expression indicated disbelief. I can, too. You'll have ample chance to prove it, I fear, said the harper, smiling at his new apprentice's stout claim. What you will also have to prove, young Pimer, is your discretion. Now, the harper was in solemn earnest, and with equal solemnity, Pimer nodded assurance. Menely tells me that despite your incorrigibility on many other counts, you're not given to indiscriminate babbling. Rather, and the harper held up his hand as Pimer opened his mouth to reassure him, that you keep close about incidental information until you can use it to your benefit. Me, sir? Master Robinson smiled at his wide-eyed, innocent expression. You, sir, young Pimer, although it does strike me that you are exactly the sort of guile, he broke off, then continued more briskly, leaving unsaid words to tantalize Pimer. We'll see how you get on. I fear you may find your new role not as exciting as you think, but you will be serving your craft and me very well indeed. If he couldn't sing for a while, thought Pimer, being the master's apprentice was the next best thing. Wait till he told Bonds and Timony. Wouldn't they just choke? Ever sailed? Asked Menely with such a piercing look that Pimer wondered if she'd read his thoughts. Sailed? In a boat? That's the general method, she said. With my luck, you'll be a seasicker. You mean I might get to the southern continent, too? Asked Pimer, having rapidly added up assorted pieces of information and come to a conclusion. All too hastily spoken, he realized belatedly. The harper lost all semblance of lassitude and sat bolt upright in his chair, causing his fire lizard to protest vehemently. Menely burst out laughing. I told you, master, she said, throwing up her hands. And what makes you mention the southern continent? Asked the harper. Pimer was rather sorry now that he had. Well, sir, nothing special, he said, wondering himself. Just things like Sibyl being gone for a couple of 7 days midwinter and coming back with a tanned face. Only I'd known he'd not been in Nerat or Southern Bowl or Ista. There's been talk, too, at the gathers that even if dragon riders from the north aren't supposed to go south, some of the old-timers have been seen there or here in the north. Now, if I were Falar, I'd sort of wonder who those old-timers were doing north, and I'd try to keep them south, where they are supposed to be, and there are all these holdless men looking for someplace to live, and no one seems to know how big the southern continent is, and if... Pimer trailed off, daunted by the keen scrutiny of the master harper. And if... Master Robinson urged him to continue. Well, I've had to copy that map Fënor made of the southern hold for Weir, and it's small, no bigger in Crom and Nabol. But I've heard from Weir folk at high reaches who were in the south before Falar exiled the worst of the old-timers, that they said they were sure the southern continent must be pretty big. Pimer gestured broadly. And? The harper's encouragement was firm. Well, sir, if it were me, I'd want to know, 'cause sure as eggs hatch, there's going to be trouble with those old-timers south, he jerked his thumb in that direction, and trouble with the holdless men in the north. He turned his thumb back, so when Meneley talks about sailing, I know how Sibyl got south without being taken by a dragon, which Bendon Weir wouldn't permit, 'cause they promised the northern dragons wouldn't go south, and I don't think Sibyl could swim that far if he can swim. Master Robinson began to laugh, a soft chuckle, and he slowly swung his head from side to side. I wonder how many more people have put that same pieces together, Meneley, he asked, frowning. When his journeyman shrugged, he added to Pimer, You've kept such notions to yourself, young man. Pimer gave a snort, realizing he must be more circumspect with the master of his craft, and said quickly, Who pays any attention to what apprentices think or say? Have you mentioned these notions to anyone? The harper was insistent. Of course not, sir. Pimer tried to keep indignation from his tone. It's Bendon's business, or Hold business, or Harper business, not mine. A chance-spoken word, even by an apprentice, can sift through a man's thoughts till he forgets the source and remembers the intent, and repeats it inadvisedly. I know my loyalty to my craft hall, Master Robinson, said Pimer. I'm sure of your loyalty, the harper said, holding his head slowly, his eyes still holding Pimer's. I want to be certain of your discretion. Meneley'll tell you I'm not a babble-mouth. He looked at Meneley for her support. Not normally, I'm sure, but you might be tempted to speak when taunted by others. Me, sir? Pimer's indignation was genuine. Not me, sir. I may be small, but I'm not stupid. Now, no one could accuse you of that, my young friend, but as you've already pointed out, we are living in an uncertain turn, I think. The harper broke off, staring out the window, frowning absently. Abruptly, he made a decision and regarded Pimer for a long moment. Meneley told me you were quick-witted. Let's see if you comprehend the reason behind this. You will not be known as my apprentice. And Master Robinson smiled understandingly at Pimer's sharp intake of breath. Then he nodded with approval as Pimer promptly schooled his expression to polite acceptance. You will be told off as an apprentice to the drum master, Olodki, who will know that you are under my orders as well. Yes, and the crispness of Master Robinson's tone told Pimer that he was pleased by this solution, and Pimer had better be. That will serve. The drummers must, of course, keep irregular hours. No one would note your absences or think anything of your taking messages. Master Robinson put his hand on Pimer's shoulder and gave him a little shake, smiling kindly. No one will miss your boyish trouble more than I, lad, except possibly Dominic. But here in the Harper Hall, some of us listen to other tunes and drum a different beat. He gave Pimer another shake, then cuffed him on the shoulder encouragingly. I don't want you to stop listening, Pimer, not if you can take isolated facts and put them together as well as you just did. But I also want you to notice the way things are said, the tone and inflection, the emphasis. Pimer mustered a grin. What a harper hears is for the harper's ears, sir. Master Robinson laughed. Good lad. Now take this tray back to Sylvina and ask her to fit you out with a weirhide. A drummer has to be at his post in all weathers. You don't need weirhide on the drum height, exclaimed Pimer. Then he grinned as he cocked his head to his master. You do need it if you're riding a dragon's back, though. I told you he was quick, said Meneley, grinning at the harper's consternation. Scamp! Rascal! Impertinent snip! Cried the harper, dismissing him with a vigorous wave of his hand that set Zare squawking. Do as you're told and keep your notions to yourself. Then I will be riding dragons, said Pimer, and when he saw Master Robinson rise half out of his chair, he quickly slipped out of the room. What did I tell you, master? Said Meneley, laughing. He's quick enough to be very useful. Though the glint of amusement remained in his eyes, the harper stared thoughtfully at the closed door, his fingers tapping idly on his chair arm. Quick, yes, but a shade young. Young, Pimer? He was never young, that one. Don't let that innocent, wide-eyed stare of his fool you. Besides, he'd got 14 turns, almost as old as I was when I left Half-Circle Seahold to live in the Dragon's Stones cave with my fire lizards. And what else can be done with all his energy and mischief? He's simply not suited for any other section of this craft. Master Shanagar was the only person who had half a chance of keeping him out of trouble. Old Arnor couldn't, nor Geraint. It's got to be Olodki and the drums. I could almost see the merit of the old-timers' attitudes, said the harper on the end of a heavy sigh. Sir, Meneley stared at him, startled as much by the abrupt change of subject as the sense of what he said. I wish we hadn't changed so in this last long interval. But, sir, you've been supporting all the changes Falar and Lessa have advocated, and Bendon's been right to make those changes. They've united Hall and Hold behind the wares. Furthermore, and Meneley took a deep breath, Siebel told me not so long ago that before this pass of the Red Star began, harpers were nearly as discredited as dragon riders. You've made this hall into the most prestigious craft on Pern. Everyone respects Master Harper Robinson, even Pimer, she added with a laugh trembling in her voice as she struggled to relieve her master's melancholy. Ah, now, there's the real accomplishment. Indeed it is, she said, ignoring his fastidiousness, for he's very hard to impress, I assure you. Believe me, too, that he won't be in the least distressed to do for you what he does naturally for himself. He's always heard the gossip it gathers and told me, knowing I'd tell you, what a harper hears is for the harper's ears. She laughed to find Pimer's saucy quips so applicable. It was easier during the interval, Robinson said, with another long sigh. Zare, who'd been cleaning himself, chirped in a query way, tilting his head and peering with earnestly worrying eyes at his friend. The harper smiled as he stroked the little creature. Boring, too, to be completely candid. Still, it won't be that long an assignment for Pimer, will it? His voice ought to settle within the turn, and he can resume his place as a soloist. If his adult voice is half as good as his treble, he'll be a better singer than Tagrital. Seeing that prospect cheered her master, Meneley smiled. The drum message was from Istahold. Siebel's on his way back with those herbal medicines Master Oldive wanted. He'll be at Fort Seahold by late afternoon tomorrow, if the wind holds. Indeed, I'll be very interested to hear what our good Siebel has for his harper's ears. Okay, chapter 1 was really long, and I haven't been reading in a while this long for the live stream, so I'm bushed. I think we're going to call it a night. Chapter 2, the first word is the, and we'll see tomorrow. Anybody else want to say goodnight? Becca says goodnight from way over there really quietly. Here's my JJ.
Good night.
Good night. Is Daddy asleep?
Yeah. No, he's actually not. I massaged him.
Okay.